The night was oppressively dark, the kind that devoured even the faintest glimmers of starlight. Ethan stepped out of his old pickup truck, his boots crunching against the gravel road that bordered the sprawling cornfield. The air was unnaturally still, save for the occasional rustling of dry corn leaves that whispered secrets to the wind. In the distance, an eerie, bluish glow flickered intermittently among the stalks, like phantom fireflies beckoning him deeper into the abyss. Ethan felt a chill creep up his spine, but he gripped his camera tighter, determined to capture the truth behind the strange stories he'd heard in the nearby town. As he moved closer to the field, the world around him seemed to change. The once familiar hum of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl were replaced by an unnatural silence, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. The cornfield loomed before him like a living entity, its rows impossibly tall and tightly packed, creating an unwelcoming wall of shadow. Ethan hesitated for a moment, his instincts screaming for him to turn back, but his curiosity won the battle. With a deep breath, he stepped onto the dirt path that snaked its way into the corn's labyrinthine embrace. The moment his foot crossed the threshold, the atmosphere shifted. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, like rusted iron. A faint sound reached his ears, a rhythmic tapping that seemed to echo all around him. At first, he dismissed it as the wind playing tricks, but the pattern was deliberate, too deliberate to be natural. Tap, tap, tap. It was as if something, or someone, was signaling his arrival. Ethan's pulse quickened, his breath shallow as he ventured deeper into the field. The stalks swayed ever so slightly, though the air was completely still. He could feel them brushing against him, their dry, brittle leaves grazing his arms like skeletal fingers. Suddenly, his flashlight beam caught something out of place. 2 pinpricks of light, glowing faintly between the rows ahead. They weren't the bluish glow he'd seen from afar. These were different, sharper, more alive. They blinked. He froze, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure it would give him away. The lights disappeared for a moment, only to reappear closer, hovering at his eye level. They weren't just lights, they were eyes, unblinking and predatory. Ethan's grip on his camera tightened, his mind racing through every rational explanation he could muster. But none of them made sense. The eyes didn't belong to any animal he'd ever seen. They were too deliberate, too intelligent, and filled with an unnatural hunger that made his skin crawl. A low, guttural sound, half growl, half sigh, emerged from the shadows. It wasn't loud, but it vibrated through Ethan's very core, a sound that bypassed his ears and went straight to the primal part of his brain that screamed danger. The eyes vanished again, and this time, the rustling of corn followed, moving in a circular pattern around him. Whatever it wasn't just watching him, it was toying with him. Panicked, Ethan aimed his flashlight in every direction, the beam slicing through the oppressive darkness but revealing nothing but endless rows of corn. He felt the ground beneath him shift, as though the earth itself was alive, subtly pulling him deeper into the field. A faint whisper began to rise, too low to make out words but loud enough to fill the silence. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, growing louder with each passing second. Then he saw it, an old, tattered scarecrow leaning unnaturally against a wooden pole. Its head was tilted at an odd angle, and its eyes, or rather, the empty holes where eyes should have been, seemed to follow him. Around its neck hung an amulet, crude and ancient, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shimmer in the flashlight's glow. Ethan felt an inexplicable pull toward it, as if the amulet was calling to him. But as he took a hesitant step forward, a sudden gust of icy wind rushed past him, extinguishing his flashlight and plunging him into complete darkness. The tapping returned, louder and more erratic, closing in from all directions. Ethan's breath hitched as he realized the tapping wasn't coming from the corn. It was coming from behind him. He turned slowly, his body trembling, only to find those eyes staring back at him, closer than ever. They blinked once, twice, and then vanished again, leaving him alone in the suffocating blackness, his own panicked breathing the only sound in the endless field of shadows. As Ethan stood paralyzed in the oppressive darkness, his trembling fingers fumbled with the flashlight, desperately trying to reignite its beam. When the light finally flickered back on, the world around him seemed eerily transformed. The once static corn stalks now swayed gently, though no wind stirred the air. His gaze was drawn back to the scarecrow. It was closer, its lifeless form somehow angled toward him. The amulet hanging from its neck glinted faintly, as if catching light from an invisible source. Ethan's heart pounded with an unfamiliar sense of dread. There was something about that amulet, something that scratched at the edges of his memory, like a persistent ghost. He approached the scarecrow cautiously, the ground beneath his boots soft and damp as though freshly turned. Reaching out, his hand hovered over the amulet, hesitating. The moment his fingers brushed its cold, jagged surface, a sudden flash of memory erupted in his mind. A vivid, jarring image of a small boy clutching an identical amulet. That boy was Ethan. In his vision, he saw himself as a child running through this same cornfield during one of his summer visits to his grandmother's farmhouse. She had always warned him to stay away from the field, calling it a cursed place, but curiosity had driven him to explore. He remembered stumbling upon the same scarecrow, though it had been less decayed back then, and finding the amulet buried in the dirt at its feet. His grandmother had appeared moments later, her face pale with terror. She had snatched the amulet from his hands, muttering prayers under her breath, and forbade him from speaking of it again. Ethan's chest tightened as fragments of his grandmother's words resurfaced. The eyes in the cornfield see your deepest sins. If you look too long, they'll see through you. He had dismissed her warnings back then as the ramblings of an old woman steeped in superstition. But now, standing in the very field she had feared, he couldn't deny the suffocating presence of something ancient and malignant. The scarecrow seemed almost alive, its hollow eyes fixed on Ethan with an unnatural intensity. Clutching the amulet, he felt a sharp sting in his palm, as though the object itself resisted his touch. He glanced down and saw that the symbols etched into its surface were faintly glowing, pulsating like a heartbeat. Suddenly, a cold, distant whisper filled the air, a voice both unfamiliar and hauntingly intimate. "You've come back, just like before." The whisper sent shivers racing down Ethan's spine. It wasn't coming from the scarecrow, nor from the field. It was coming from inside his own mind. The voice carried a weight of accusation, as if it knew him, as if it had been waiting for him to return. He staggered backward, dropping the amulet, which landed with a dull thud at the scarecrow's feet. In that moment, the ground beneath him shifted, and Ethan felt his boots sink slightly into the soil. Glancing down, he froze in horror. A skeletal hand was slowly emerging from the dirt, its bony fingers reaching for the amulet. He stumbled back, his flashlight trembling in his grip, and saw more hands clawing their way to the surface, their pale, lifeless forms illuminated by the faint glow of the symbols. Ethan's breathing quickened, his chest heaving as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to move. One of the skeletal hands grasped the amulet and lifted it toward the scarecrow, as if offering it in supplication. The glow intensified, spreading through the amulet like wildfire, and the scarecrow twitched violently, its wooden frame creaking as if struggling against invisible restraints. Ethan's memories flooded back with a vengeance, each one more vivid than the last. He recalled hearing his grandmother sobbing late at night, praying for forgiveness for something she had never explained. He remembered the day she burned a bundle of photographs, her hands shaking as she tossed them into the flames. And now, standing in this cursed field, Ethan realized the truth he had repressed for years. The amulet wasn't just a relic, it was a seal. His grandmother had spent her life trying to contain whatever lurked in the cornfield, and Ethan had just undone her work. The whispers grew louder, merging into a cacophony of voices that seemed to rise from the very soil beneath his feet. They called his name, taunting him, accusing him. The scarecrow's hollow gaze burned into him, and Ethan knew with chilling certainty that this was no ordinary haunting. The field itself was alive, a prison for something that should never have been disturbed. With shaking hands, Ethan picked up the amulet, its glow searing against his skin. He didn't know how to fix what he had unleashed, but he knew one thing for certain. The field wasn't going to let him leave without paying the price for his curiosity. Ethan's heartbeat thundered in his chest as the whispers around him grew into a distorted symphony of agony and rage. The skeletal hands that had emerged from the soil were no longer just remnants of the past. They were alive, clawing and writhing, as if desperate to drag him into the earth. The amulet in his hand felt heavier, pulsating like a living thing, its glow now erratic and threatening to consume him. The cornfield seemed to close in, the stalks forming an impenetrable wall that cut off any hope of escape. He was trapped. The scarecrow began to move, its wooden limbs jerking unnaturally, as though an unseen force manipulated its broken frame. Its hollow face twisted, the burlap sack that formed its head shifting into a grotesque mockery of a human expression. A deep, guttural voice emanated from it, but its mouth didn't move. The voice reverberated in Ethan's mind, bypassing his ears entirely. "You've trespassed where the living are not welcome. Now you must choose, Ethan. Sacrifice or suffer." Ethan's legs nearly gave out as the voice echoed through him. Sacrifice? What did it mean? His gaze darted around the field, searching for a way out, but the whispers were now joined by distorted laughter, mocking his desperation. The ground beneath him trembled, and he realized the choice wasn't a metaphor, it was a command. The entity demanded payment for his intrusion. As if reading his thoughts, the scarecrow raised an arm, its fingers pointing to the amulet in Ethan's trembling hand. A wave of dread washed over him as images flooded his mind. His childhood memories, his grandmother's face, the fleeting moments of joy he had buried under years of cynicism and regret. The amulet seemed to pulse in rhythm with these memories, as if drawing energy from them. Ethan understood. The amulet wasn't just a seal, it was a vessel, and the entity was hungry. The voice spoke again, colder this time, each word slicing through him like a blade. You must surrender what binds you to this world. A memory, a piece of your soul, or perhaps your sanity. Choose wisely, for the corn remembers. Ethan staggered backward, the weight of the decision suffocating him. If he gave up his memories, who would he be? If he surrendered his sanity, would he ever leave the field whole? And then there was the unspoken alternative, to give himself entirely. His mind raced as he considered the possibilities, each more horrifying than the last. Suddenly, the whispers ceased, replaced by an unnatural silence that pressed down on him like a physical force. The scarecrow lowered its arm, and the air around Ethan grew colder, freezing his breath in the night. The voice returned, quieter but no less menacing. Make your choice, Ethan, or the field will decide for you. In that moment, a vision struck him with the force of a lightning bolt. He saw himself as a child again, standing in the field, the amulet in his hand, and his grandmother's voice echoing in the distance. But the scene shifted, and now he was an adult, standing before the scarecrow as it loomed over him. The images blurred together, and he realized the entity had been waiting for him all along, weaving its trap across time. The amulet had been a tether, ensuring that he would return to finish what had been started generations ago. Ethan dropped to his knees, his mind a storm of fear and regret. The ground beneath him pulsed like a heartbeat, and he could feel the cornfield watching, waiting. His choices were laid bare. He could destroy the amulet, severing the connection and potentially dooming himself to an eternity in the field, or he could use it to contain the entity, sacrificing a piece of himself in the process. But there was a third, unspoken option, the one the field whispered to him in seductive tones: give himself completely and end the cycle. Tears streamed down his face as he clutched the amulet tighter, its heat searing his palm. The memories it contained, the echoes of his grandmother's laughter, the warmth of the sunlit afternoons they had shared, threatened to slip away as the entity fed on his hesitation. He screamed into the silence, a primal, guttural sound that seemed to shake the very ground. I choose. Before he could finish, the scarecrow lunged forward, its wooden body creaking and snapping, and the earth opened beneath him. Ethan's scream was swallowed by the darkness, and the field erupted into chaos, the stalks thrashing violently as if alive. Whatever choice he had made or failed to make had set something irreversible into motion. The cornfield had claimed him, and the amulet fell silent in his hand, its glow extinguished. When the silence returned, the field was still once more, the scarecrow standing motionless, its hollow eyes staring out into the void. The whispers faded, but the corn remembered. It always remembered. Ethan awoke with a jolt, his body sprawled on the damp soil of the cornfield. His mind was a haze, fragments of his last moments slipping through his grasp like smoke. The amulet was still clutched in his hand, its surface cold and lifeless, a stark contrast to the fiery pulse it once radiated. The air around him was heavy, pressing against his chest, as if the field itself was alive and breathing. The silence was deafening, broken only by a faint, otherworldly whisper that seemed to drift through the rows of corn. The whisper was soft at first, almost tender, like a lullaby carried on the wind. But as Ethan strained to listen, the sweetness turned sour. The voice grew louder, layering upon itself, becoming a cacophony of overlapping tones. Some voices were guttural and deep, others high-pitched and shrill, but all of them carried a singular message. You don't belong here. Ethan staggered to his feet, his legs unsteady beneath him. The whisper followed him, weaving through the stalks, always just out of reach. His flashlight flickered weakly, casting long, erratic shadows that seemed to writhe and shift of their own accord. Every direction looked the same, endless rows of corn stretching into darkness. The stalks swayed unnaturally, forming twisting patterns as if the field itself were alive, rearranging its labyrinthine corridors to keep him trapped. Then, the shadows began to move. At first, Ethan thought it was a trick of the flickering light, but the movements were deliberate. Figures emerged from the darkness, shapeless and amorphous, their edges blurred like ink bleeding into paper. They danced around him, their forms twisting and undulating, accompanied by the same sinister whispers that clawed at his sanity. Ethan swung his flashlight wildly, the beam cutting through the air, but the figures evaporated each time the light touched them, only to reappear moments later, closer than before. Suddenly, the whisper became a deafening roar, and Ethan clapped his hands over his ears, dropping the flashlight in the process. The light rolled across the ground, casting erratic beams that illuminated fleeting glimpses of the horrors around him. A skeletal hand protruding from the soil, the hollow eyes of the scarecrow watching from a distance, and the faint outline of something massive moving just beyond the rows. Ethan fell to his knees, his breathing ragged as the voices coalesced into a singular tone. It was no longer an unintelligible murmur. It was speaking directly to him. "You have awakened us." The voice was ancient, filled with malice and hunger. "Do you remember the songs your grandmother sang? They were for us. She kept us here. But you, Ethan, you've broken the circle." A chilling realization struck him. The whispers weren't just voices. They were the remnants of those who had come before him, those who had been claimed by the field. They weren't warning him to leave. They were lamenting their own fates, bound to the soil for eternity. He could feel their pain, their fear, their desperation. And now, they were pulling him into their world. The shadows grew bolder, creeping closer, their forms taking on grotesque, half-human shapes. One reached out, its elongated fingers brushing against his shoulder. Ethan screamed as an icy chill spread through his body, the sensation like shards of glass slicing through his veins. He stumbled back, his hand instinctively gripping the amulet. The amulet began to glow faintly once more, its light casting a feeble barrier between Ethan and the encroaching shadows. The figures hissed and recoiled, their forms dissipating into the air. But the reprieve was short-lived. The whisper shifted again, its tone now mocking. "Do you think that will save you? You cannot undo what you've unleashed." Ethan's mind raced as he pieced together the fragments of his grandmother's stories. The songs, the prayers, the amulet, they had been tools to bind the entity, to keep it dormant. But now the seal was broken, and the field was alive with its hatred. He realized that the whispers weren't just warnings, they were instructions. The field was speaking to him, guiding him deeper into its grasp. The shadows began to part, revealing a path that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. At the far end, a faint glow flickered, a cold, unnatural light that called to him. Ethan hesitated, every instinct screaming at him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The cornfield was a prison, and the only way out was through. Clutching the amulet tightly, he stepped forward, the whispers growing louder with each step. The further he walked, the more the field seemed to change. The corn stalks twisted unnaturally, their tips curving downward like claws. The soil beneath his feet felt soft and wet, as if it were alive, pulsing with a heartbeat that matched his own. The light ahead grew brighter, revealing the outline of a figure standing motionless in the distance. Ethan stopped, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was humanoid but wrong, its proportions stretched and warped. Its eyes glowed with the same eerie light that had first drawn him into the field. It didn't move, but Ethan could feel its gaze boring into him, stripping him of every layer of courage he had left. The whispers fell silent, replaced by a single, chilling phrase that echoed in his mind. "Come closer, Ethan. We've been waiting for you." Ethan stood frozen, his body trembling as the glowing figure ahead remained eerily still, its presence oppressive and suffocating. The cornfield seemed to pulse around him, each stalk bending slightly, as if leaning in to watch. The faint, unnatural glow illuminated the twisted features of the figure. Its face was stretched, skin taut over hollowed bones, and its eyes burned like pale, dying embers. Ethan's breaths came in shallow gasps as the whispers resumed, now sharper, more urgent. Each word sliced through his mind, a dark hymn laced with dread. "Your fear feeds us," the voices hissed, overlapping and echoing from every direction. "It nourishes the roots, binds the soil, strengthens the curse. Let it consume you." The whispers weren't just words. They were a pull, an insidious temptation burrowing into Ethan's thoughts. He could feel his own terror blooming like a black flower, its petals wrapping around his mind. The glowing figure seemed to shift, though it hadn't moved. Its presence expanded, filling every shadow in his vision. The air grew colder, and Ethan's body ached, as if the very field were leeching his strength. He took a hesitant step backward, but the ground beneath his feet shifted unnaturally, as though the earth itself recoiled at his defiance. His boots sank slightly into the soil, which now felt more like flesh than dirt, warm and pulsing. Ethan yanked his foot free, stumbling as he tried to focus. The whispers grew louder, their tone mocking, cruel. Do you feel it? The futility? The weight of your fear? You cannot escape it, Ethan. You cannot escape us. Images began to flash in his mind, disjointed and horrifying. His grandmother's face twisted in anguish, her hands clawing at the amulet. The scarecrow watching him as a child, its empty gaze following his every move, and himself older, standing where the glowing figure now stood, his eyes ablaze with the same cursed light. Each vision felt real, as though it had already happened, or was destined to happen. Ethan's grip tightened around the amulet, its faint warmth the only tether keeping him grounded. But even that felt tenuous, the glow flickering as his resolve wavered. The figure ahead raised an arm slowly, impossibly long fingers curling as if beckoning him closer. The whispers shifted again, now softer, almost tender. We can make it stop, they promised. Give in. Relinquish your fear, your pain, your memories. Let us take it all away. All you have to do is step forward. The temptation was palpable, like a siren's call luring him into the abyss. Ethan could feel the weight of his fear crushing him, threatening to snap his sanity like a brittle branch. The whispers were right. He was exhausted, his body and mind frayed by the relentless terror. What harm would it do to give in? To let the field have what it wanted? But then, a new whisper emerged, faint and distant, cutting through the cacophony. It was a voice he recognized, his grandmother's. Ethan, don't listen. Fear is their weapon, but it is also your strength. Fight it. Use it. Her words jolted him like ice water, snapping him back to the present. Ethan looked down at the amulet in his hand, its surface now glowing faintly, responding to his resolve. The figure ahead hissed, its glowing eyes narrowing, and the whispers grew angrier, more desperate. She cannot save you, they snarled. She could barely save herself. Do you want to end up like her, bound to this field? Another voice in the shadows? Ethan forced himself to breathe, slow and deliberate, his mind pushing back against the tide of fear. He gritted his teeth, raising the amulet as if it were a shield. The glowing figure flinched, its form flickering like a dying flame. The shadows around him writhed, and the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. Suddenly, the figure lunged forward, closing the distance between them in an instant. Its face was inches from Ethan's, its hollow features contorted in rage. Ethan stumbled back, the amulet's glow intensifying as he held it up defensively. The figure's hand shot out, its fingers curling around Ethan's wrist like iron. Pain shot through his arm, and his vision blurred as the whispers invaded his mind. The figure's voice rose above them all, a guttural, inhuman growl. You cannot resist. Fear is who you are. It is all you have. But Ethan's grandmother's voice echoed again, steady and firm. Fear is not the end, Ethan. It's the beginning. Harness it. Let it drive you. Summoning every ounce of strength he had left, Ethan focused on the amulet, its warmth spreading through his hand. The glowing figure recoiled, its grip loosening as the light from the amulet grew blinding. The whispers shrieked in unison, their dissonant harmony collapsing into chaos. The figure dissolved into shadow, its form scattering like smoke in the wind. The whispers faded, leaving only a deafening silence. Ethan collapsed to the ground, the amulet still glowing faintly in his hand. The field around him remained still, but he could feel the tension in the air. It wasn't over. Whatever had been silenced would return. The cornfield wasn't done with him yet. Ethan crouched on the damp soil, his body trembling as the faint glow of the amulet pulsed in his hand. The whispers had vanished, leaving an eerie, deafening silence that pressed down on him like a physical weight. The stillness wasn't a relief, it was a warning. He could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating, as though the cornfield itself was holding its breath, waiting. Somewhere in the distance, a low, resonant hum began to rise, faint at first but growing steadily louder. The ground beneath Ethan vibrated, a deep, rhythmic thrum that matched the pulse of the amulet. The stalks of corn around him seemed to bow inward, creating a narrow tunnel that led deeper into the field. The path shimmered faintly, as though lit by a ghostly light emanating from somewhere far ahead. Ethan's instinct screamed at him to turn back, to run, but he knew there was no escape. The field had already claimed him. The only way out was to face whatever waited at the end of that path. He stood slowly, clutching the amulet tightly, its glow now steady but dim. Every step he took down the corridor of corn felt heavier, as if the earth itself resisted his movement. The whispers returned, faint and distorted, like distant echoes bouncing off the edges of his mind. They weren't taunting him anymore, they were pleading. "Turn back. It's too late. You'll never be the same." Ethan shook his head, trying to silence the voices, but they burrowed deeper, clawing at his thoughts. His pace quickened, driven by equal parts determination and desperation. The hum grew louder, transforming into a low, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the field. The light ahead flickered like a dying flame, casting long, unnatural shadows that danced and twisted along the path. Finally, Ethan emerged into a clearing at the center of the cornfield. The space was impossibly vast, the sky above obscured by swirling clouds that glowed with an unnatural greenish hue. In the center of the clearing stood a massive, gnarled tree, its branches twisted and bare, stretching upward like skeletal arms. The air around it shimmered with a sickly light, and the hum vibrated from its core, resonating through the ground. At the base of the tree, a figure stood waiting. It was the same glowing entity Ethan had seen before, but now its form was clearer, more defined. Its body was emaciated, its skin a sickly gray that seemed to ripple as though something moved beneath it. Its eyes burned with a cold, unholy light, and its elongated fingers dripped with a dark, tar-like substance that pooled at its feet. The figure tilted its head, regarding Ethan with an unsettling curiosity. When it spoke, its voice was a chorus of tones, male and female, young and old, human and inhuman. "You have come far, Ethan. You carry the key, just as she did before you." Ethan's grip tightened on the amulet. "What do you want from me?" he demanded, though his voice trembled with fear. The figure stepped closer, its movements fluid yet jerky, as though each step was a struggle against invisible restraints. "I want what was promised," it said, its voice dripping with malice. "Your bloodline has bound me for generations, but the seal is broken. You must finish what she could not. You must choose." Ethan felt a cold weight settle over him as the ground beneath the tree split open, revealing a yawning chasm filled with swirling darkness. From the depths, faint shapes began to emerge, faces twisted in agony, hands reaching upward, voices crying out in anguish. The sight sent a wave of nausea crashing over him. The figure gestured toward the chasm. "One life to close the rift, Ethan. Yours or another's." Ethan's stomach turned as the weight of the choice pressed down on him. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent, as though the souls trapped in the chasm were begging for release. He could see their faces now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, their features distorted but familiar. His grandmother's face appeared among them, her expression filled with pain and regret. The figure extended its hand, its fingers impossibly long and sharp. "The seal is weakened, but it can still hold. Offer your soul, and the field will remain dormant." Or, it turned its gaze toward the edge of the clearing, where Ethan now noticed a faint shadow moving among the corn. A chill ran through him as a memory surfaced. He had passed a farmhouse on his way here, its lights faintly glowing in the distance. Someone else was out there. "Bring them here," the figure hissed. "Give them to me, and you will go free. The field does not care whose blood is spilled." Ethan's mind raced. The idea of sacrificing an innocent person made his stomach churn, but the thought of losing himself to this place, of becoming another voice in the cornfield, filled him with paralyzing dread. The amulet in his hand pulsed faintly, as if urging him to act, but it offered no answers. The figure stepped closer, its glowing eyes boring into him. "Choose, Ethan," it said, its voice a low, guttural growl. "The field demands its price." Tears streamed down Ethan's face as he stared at the chasm, at the tortured souls clawing for freedom, at the figure that loomed over him like a living nightmare. His grandmother's voice echoed in his mind once more, faint but steady. "Do not let fear guide you. It is a weapon, but only if you let it be." Summoning every ounce of courage he had left, Ethan raised the amulet high. The figure hissed, recoiling slightly as the glow intensified. The whispers grew louder, chaotic, as though the field itself was rebelling against his defiance. Ethan took a deep breath, his voice steady despite the terror that gripped him. "I choose to end this," he said, his voice firm. The ground beneath him trembled violently as the amulet's light exploded outward, engulfing the clearing in blinding brilliance. The figure screamed, its form dissolving into shadow, and the chasm began to close, the tortured faces sinking back into the darkness. Ethan fell to his knees, the amulet burning in his hand as the world around him dissolved into a deafening roar of light and sound. When the light faded, the field was silent once more. The tree was gone, and the ground beneath it was solid, unbroken. Ethan lay motionless, the amulet now cold and lifeless in his hand. The whispers had ceased, but the memory of them lingered, etched into his soul. As he rose to his feet, he realized that the field had let him go, but at a cost he couldn't yet comprehend. He turned back toward the path, his body heavy with exhaustion, knowing that the true weight of his choice would follow him forever. Ethan staggered toward the edge of the clearing, his legs trembling beneath him. The air around him was deathly still, yet the oppressive weight of the cornfield remained, pressing against his chest like a smothering hand. He clutched the now cold amulet in his hand, its surface dull and lifeless. The whispers had ceased, but the silence was far from comforting. It felt like the calm before a storm, a moment of fragile stillness before the final blow. Just as he reached the first row of corn, the ground beneath him quaked violently. A low, guttural roar erupted from the earth, shaking the field to its core. Ethan spun around to see the clearing he had just left transforming before his eyes. The gnarled tree that had vanished moments ago was re-emerging, its roots clawing up from the soil like serpents. The glowing figure returned as well, but now it was no longer restrained by the chasm or the amulet's faint protection. It stood tall, its form shifting and expanding, the light in its eyes burning hotter and more furious than before. The voice that emanated from the figure was no longer a whisper. It was a deafening, guttural command that seemed to resonate from every direction. "You thought you could bind me again, Ethan? You are nothing but a pawn in a cycle older than your bloodline." The figure raised its arms, and the cornfield came alive. Stalks twisted and bent unnaturally, their sharp leaves slicing through the air as if wielded by invisible hands. The earth split in jagged lines, revealing more skeletal hands clawing their way out of the soil. Ethan stumbled back, clutching the amulet as though it could still protect him, though its light had completely faded. From the fractured earth, ghostly forms began to rise, pale, translucent figures that writhed in agony. Their faces were twisted, their mouths open in silent screams. Ethan recognized some of them, the faces of villagers from old photographs at his grandmother's house, people she had spoken of in hushed tones. They were the souls bound to the field, prisoners of the entity's wrath. And now they were coming for him. Ethan backed away as the ghostly figures advanced, their movements jerky and unnatural. They surrounded him, their eyes hollow but accusing, their hands reaching out with skeletal fingers. He swung the amulet wildly, but it offered no protection. The figures passed through him, each touch sending a searing chill through his body, as if they were pulling pieces of him away. The glowing figure laughed, a deep, resonant sound that shook the ground. "You are mine, Ethan. Your fear has fed me, your choices have freed me, and now you will join them." Ethan fell to his knees, his mind racing for a solution. The memories of his grandmother came flooding back, her warnings, her prayers, the day she burned the amulet's twin in the fireplace. She had always spoken of the field as a place of sacrifice, a place where only courage and selflessness could prevail. But what did that mean now? What could he possibly do against a force so ancient, so powerful? His grandmother's voice echoed faintly in his mind. "It's not the amulet. It's the intent. The sacrifice is the seal." Ethan's gaze fell to the amulet in his hand, its surface cracked and tarnished. If the amulet itself wasn't the key, then it was merely a tool, a focus for something greater. The figure loomed over him now, its form shifting and growing until it seemed to blot out the sky. Its voice thundered, a cacophony of rage and triumph. "There is no escape, Ethan. You are mine." Summoning the last shreds of his courage, Ethan stood. His body was weak, his mind battered, but a flicker of determination burned within him. He raised the amulet high, his voice trembling but defiant. "I am not yours," he shouted. "You won't take me, and you won't take anyone else. Not anymore." The figure recoiled slightly, its light flickering as if Ethan's words had struck a nerve. The ghostly forms paused, their hollow eyes turning toward him, as though waiting for something. Ethan closed his eyes, focusing on the memories that mattered most. The warmth of his grandmother's laughter, the sunlit days spent by her side, her unwavering belief that he was capable of more than he ever realized. Opening his eyes, he gripped the amulet tightly and spoke again, his voice stronger this time. "I offer my fear, my doubts, my pain. Take them, but you'll never have me." The amulet flared to life, its cracks glowing with an intense, golden light. The ghostly forms let out an otherworldly wail as the light spread, burning away the shadows and the entity's twisted roots. The glowing figure screamed, its form distorting and collapsing in on itself as the light consumed it. The cornfield erupted into chaos, the ground trembling violently as the stalks twisted and snapped. Ethan braced himself, the amulet's light surrounding him like a protective shield. The entity's voice rose one last time, a furious, echoing roar. "This is not the end, Ethan. The field remembers, and so will you." With a final burst of light, the clearing exploded, and Ethan was thrown backward. When he opened his eyes, the field was still. The corn stood silent and unmoving, the oppressive weight in the air lifted. The amulet lay shattered in his hand, its glow extinguished forever. Ethan rose unsteadily, his body aching but his heart lighter. The whispers were gone, the ghosts silenced, and the field no longer held its sinister grip. But as he walked away, the entity's final words echoed faintly in his mind. "The field remembers." He didn't look back. The sun was beginning to rise as Ethan stumbled out of the cornfield, its golden rays cutting through the mist that clung to the landscape. He felt the warmth on his skin, but found no comfort in it. His mind was a storm of fragmented memories and lingering fear. The oppressive whispers had ceased, the shadows no longer clawed at his heels, but the silence that followed carried its own kind of dread. Ethan didn't know if he had truly won, or if the entity had merely retreated, biding its time. He turned back to the field one last time. In the daylight, it appeared almost serene, the rows of corn swaying gently in the breeze as if nothing had ever happened. But Ethan knew better. The field was alive, watching, waiting. He could feel its presence still, a faint vibration in the earth beneath his feet. The memory of the glowing figure, its hollow eyes burning with malevolence, sent a shiver down his spine. As he made his way back to his truck, parked on the dirt road where this nightmare had begun, he noticed something strange. His boots left no tracks in the soil. The ground was undisturbed, as if he had never set foot in the field at all. He stopped, his heart pounding, and looked back again. The scarecrow was gone, and so was the amulet. It was as if the field had erased any evidence of his presence, leaving only the chilling memory etched in his mind. When he reached his truck, he slid into the driver's seat, his hands trembling as he gripped the wheel. He glanced at the rearview mirror and froze. For a fleeting moment he saw them, the glowing eyes, staring back at him from the edge of the field. They blinked once, twice, and then vanished, leaving behind only the empty rows of corn. The drive back to town felt like a blur. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something had followed him out of the field. The air in the truck felt heavier, the silence oppressive. He turned on the radio to drown out his thoughts, but the static that greeted him only made the tension worse. Every shadow on the side of the road, every flicker of movement in the corner of his vision, sent his pulse racing. When he finally reached his small apartment, Ethan locked the door behind him and collapsed onto the couch, exhaustion overtaking him. He closed his eyes, but the visions returned immediately. The glowing figure, the tortured faces in the chasm, the way the earth had felt alive beneath his feet. He shot up, gasping for air, his heart pounding. Determined to make sense of what had happened, Ethan began researching everything he could about the field, his grandmother's stories, and the strange symbols he had seen on the amulet. Old newspaper clippings and archived records revealed fragments of the field's dark history. A string of disappearances dating back centuries, whispers of a curse placed on the land by a forgotten people, and vague accounts of villagers who spoke of the eyes in the corn. But nothing explained why it had chosen him, or why it had let him go. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan found himself consumed by the mystery. He sketched the symbols from memory, trying to decode their meaning. He scoured old family records, uncovering more about his grandmother's connection to the field. It seemed that she had been part of a long line of keepers, tasked with maintaining the seal that bound the entity. But the records ended abruptly, leaving more questions than answers. One night, as he pored over the old documents, he noticed something he hadn't before. In the corner of one of his grandmother's photographs, a faded image of her standing in front of the farmhouse, there was a shadow in the background. It was faint but unmistakable, the outline of the glowing figure, watching from the cornfield. Ethan's stomach turned as a cold realization washed over him. The field hadn't let him go. It had marked him, just as it had marked his grandmother before him. He was part of its story now, bound to it in ways he couldn't yet understand. As he stared at the photograph, the lights in his apartment flickered. A faint, familiar whisper brushed against his ear, sending a chill down his spine. The field remembers. Ethan bolted upright, his eyes darting around the room. But there was nothing, only the oppressive silence that now seemed to follow him wherever he went. He moved to the window and peered outside, his breath fogging the glass. At first, all he saw was the quiet street below, empty and still. But then in the distance, he noticed something. In the glow of a street lamp, two faint points of light blinked at him from the darkness. They burned like dying embers, unblinking, watching. Ethan stumbled back from the window, his chest tightening as the whisper returned, louder this time, reverberating in his mind. You cannot escape. The field remembers, and so will you. Ethan collapsed onto the floor, his hands clutching his head as the whispers grew louder, drowning out his thoughts. He realized with horrifying clarity that the entity wasn't bound to the field anymore. It was free, and it had followed him. The lights in his apartment went out, plunging him into darkness. The last thing he saw before everything faded was his reflection in the window. For a fleeting moment, his own eyes glowed faintly, mirroring the cursed light of the entity. The next morning, the neighbors found Ethan's apartment empty. The door was unlocked, the lights still flickering, and his belongings scattered. On his desk, there was a single piece of paper with one word scrawled across it in jagged handwriting. Remember. No one ever saw Ethan again. But late at night, when the wind rustled through the nearby cornfields, some claimed to hear whispers, faint, haunting, and filled with sorrow. The field had taken him, just as it had taken so many before. And though the town moved on, the mystery lingered, a dark shadow cast over the land. The field remembers. It always remembers.